Some people have never heard they're cooking with peanut oil. Well, there you go. You can look it up. Google it. That's the great thing about Google. Well, we have been spending some time on the life of Moses and what are the lessons that we can learn in the 21st century about somebody who lived literally thousands of years ago, and yet who had a profound effect on all of our lives. And as we're going to see, when Moses takes the Ten Commandments down from Mount Sinai, all law that's worth anything is still based on the Ten Commandments. And the fact of the matter is, it's kind of interesting in our culture. It seems like we're constantly creating laws. And why are we constantly creating laws? Because we pay people to create laws. If you pay people to create laws, they're going to create laws, right? That's just the way it works. Some businesses you have whole units whose design is to buy businesses. Well, guess what they're going to do? They're going to buy businesses because that's what they're paid to do. But all law fundamentally is going to be based on the Ten Commandments, and any law that's any good that's not based on the Ten Commandments is not helpful to humankind. And we're constantly wanting to come up with new things and new ways to go about doing things that quite often are not very productive. And of course, we end up with, in the United States, large numbers of people that are incarcerated, quite often for nonviolent crimes in ways that don't make too much sense, at least not to me. And it's kind of fascinating when you think about the United States being founded by religious folks, primarily by the Puritans. The idea of incarcerating people just could not have been further from the way that the Puritans thought. It was not consistent. The idea of putting somebody in a room costing you thousands of dollars didn't make a lot of sense. And of course, the whole idea of penance or penitentiaries, we could do kind of our own class, on that topic. Anyway, we have digressed slightly, but to go back to some of the things we were talking about last Sunday, one of the things we spent some time talking about was the value of prayer and the fact that as we think about the people we're praying for, we should be doing that with the thought in mind of what can I do to help that person's situation. In other words, prayer shouldn't simply be about just, well, I'm praying that things will go well, but then I'm not going to look for opportunities to do anything to assist. Now, as we pointed out last time, sometimes there isn't anything you can do to assist. I had many people pray for me over the years who that was really all that they could do for me, and I appreciated those prayers. But conversely, sometimes as we're praying for people, things are going to occur to us that we can do that actively advance the ball or that help that person. If I were a medical professional, which I am not, and I'm praying for people, I might also be able to offer practical advice that would be helpful, or I might be able to connect them with somebody that could be helpful. And we talked about the fact that sometimes what people need is monetary. And if I've got that ability to help and assist them monetarily, I want to, as a Christian, particularly if I have more money than I need for my basic necessities and to take care of my family, which we pointed out are our first obligations, I want to be willing to do that. Anyway, we talked quite a bit about that. And what's kind of interesting to me, Tuesday, as I mentioned last Sunday, was my birthday. And I've been friends with Jerry Rushford, who many of you will remember came and did hymn stories here back in 2013, and he's a fellow historian. Well, one of the things Jerry does at Pepperdine University is every year he gives a talk about George Pepperdine. The school, Pepperdine University, is named for George Pepperdine. And George Pepperdine was a multimillionaire, made his money through a company called Western Auto Company, and it was kind of a catalog company that basically sold auto parts originally, but soon came to sell other things. So every year for 50 years at least, Jerry's given this talk to potential Pepperdine students about the life of George Pepperdine. And so Jerry's telling me this story, and he said, and Terry, when I got done, this girl came up and said, Professor Rushford, you left off the best part of the life of George Pepperdine. And Jerry's like, what? What do you mean? She goes, well, I heard you tell this story last year. And she said, one of the things that George Pepperdine said that stuck with me was the only thing that was really mine were the things I gave away. And she said it was in the context of the fact that George Pepperdine went broke, which George Pepperdine did go broke about 1950, lost all of his money. And so the point that Pepperdine was making was the only thing that he really kept was what he had given away. Whatever money he'd given away to help or benefit humanity, individual people, George Pepperdine gave a lot of money to individuals, that was all he really kept. And then she said, and he wrote that great biography, which of course Jerry knew all this. But the title of George Pepperdine's biography is Faith is My Fortune. And that's the way that it really ought to be for each one of us. So I'm listening to this Tuesday and I'm thinking, well, Jerry should have been in the class last Sunday and he could have shared all that. But that is the way we ought to be thinking about things as Christians. We want to be praying fervently for each other, for the country, for our political leaders, for all the things that God calls for us to pray for. But as we're praying, we want to be thinking about, are there things that I can do that will help or assist folks in whatever their situation is? And sometimes the answer is going to be no. Sometimes the answer is, I can't do anything, but I know somebody who can. And then I have a chance or an opportunity to connect folks. So the more active we can be as Christians in living out Christianity, the greater our influence will be. Right? Jesus said, you're like a city set on a hill that can't be hid. You don't take a light and put it under a bushel, but rather on a candlestick. And he says, so let men see your good works, that they will glorify your Father who is in heaven. I need to be about my Father's business. I need to be crediting my Father for those things that I do that are being done in his name, to his glory, to his benefit. And then remembering that whatever I have in terms of life or wealth or anything else, all comes from God. And I want to be God's servant in what I'm doing and recognize that ultimately I've got to give an account to God for the way that I live my life. So all of that I say just by way, this isn't about, sometimes people are like, oh my goodness, I feel guilt, I should have. It's not about that. It's about as we move forward, right? God's always wanting us to look forward, not backward. Sometimes we get really depressed because we spend way too much time looking backward. And we're not going to remember the past the way it really happened anyway. We're going to see that with the children of Israel, right? I mean, Moses no sooner gets them out of slavery and things look a little bit tough, and they start reimagining what their life had been like in Egypt. They think they just sat around the flesh pots and took it easy, and they forgot all about the fact that they were being beaten and brutalized and that their children were being killed and all of the things that happened. So I don't want to ever be looking back in that sense. I always like what the great pitcher Satchel Paige said, which was, don't look back, something might be gaining on you. There's definitely some truth to that. I don't want to be looking back, I want to be looking forward. And I want to focus on things as I move forward, because I can't really do anything about the past anyway. So I want to be about my Father's business. I don't want to be discouraged or despondent the way the children of Israel were. I want to understand that sometimes people are incredibly discouraged and despondent, and it's not necessarily irrational, right? Why were the children of Israel despondent? They're slaves. And what do they think their chances were for getting out of slavery? Yeah, not good. Maybe less than zero. My father used to say, son, your chances are slim and none, and slim just left town. That's how they felt. Things were not looking good, and their situation had been unchanged for 100 years plus. So they're despondent, but what is it they don't see? What are they missing? What God's got in store for you, right? You know, to me, one of the most amazing stories in the Bible is Balaam and his ass, right? That starts talking to him, and Balaam starts having this conversation with him. But what is it Balaam can't see that the jackass can see? The angel of the Lord with the sword drawn, right? You know, sometimes if the scales could be removed from our eyes and we could realize that those with us are more than those that are with evil, we would look at the world in a very different way. And quite often we too are despondent, not because we're irrational, not because things aren't really, really bad, but we're despondent because we forget that God is on our side. And that if God is for us, Paul says, who can stand against us, right? And furthermore, Paul makes clear that not only is that true, but that God has guaranteed us what? What can separate us from the love of God? Nothing. So the children of Israel have a vision problem. And honestly, you read this story and you want to think, I would never be like the children of Israel. I would be walking by faith. No, I would be right there with them, right? Why? Because it's the human condition. And part of what we have to realize is we all are weak. We therefore all need God. And so when I'm not looking toward God, I also am going to be despondent because I'm going to see the things that are depressing and discouraging. And we talked a couple of weeks ago about Elijah sitting under his juniper tree after he defeated 500 prophets of Baal and asking for himself that he could die, but he doesn't see the situation. He forgets about the power of God, and he fails to remember that there were 7,000 who hadn't bowed the knee to Baal, even in a country as evil and wicked as Israel had become. And so sometimes, we end up feeling like the Lone Ranger, and we feel like the Lone Ranger when Tonto has just left us. And we're totally discouraged because nothing seems to be going our way. Well, Moses now is sent to Pharaoh. And the message from God is very clear. I want you to let my people go. We want to go worship God. We want to go into the wilderness and worship God. And it's interesting, isn't it? That, the initial request isn't like we're leaving forever. What does that particular request tell you about Pharaoh's turning it down? Is the request really unreasonable? No. It's not unreasonable at all. And so it's interesting that as the plagues begin, we're going to find Pharaoh hardening his own heart, and then we're going to find God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And God knows what's going to happen because he knows Pharaoh's heart. He knows the sort of person that Pharaoh is. But the requests that are made by Moses are very reasonable, and they're going to be done in such a way that demonstrate the evil that is Pharaoh and that characterizes Pharaoh. And what happens when we develop the kind of pride we talked about last week? He thinks, that he is a god. Human pride, that's ultimately what it does to us as human beings. It turns us into people who believe that we really are the greatest, that we really are the best, that we really are superior to everyone else. And if you tell people they're superior to everyone else, what happens to them? They believe it. Why do we have the Green Berets? You really think the Green Berets can fight and they're tougher than everybody else? If I had the Blue Berets, I tell them the same thing. Now, granted, you try to take the best of the best, but more of that is what you're telling people than anything else. And if I believe I'm the world's greatest fighter, and if I believe that I'm fighting for a king who is divine, and that God is going to be with me, how do I tend to fight? I fight really, really tough. The average person from the Empire of Japan was 6 inches shorter than the average American. Do you think that bothered them for a second? No, because what did they believe they're fighting for? They're fighting for the emperor, Hirohito, who they believe is divine, right? And more than that, they've been raised in this whole culture where the worst thing that can happen to you by far is not death. In our culture, we tend to think, well, the worst thing that can happen is, I die. Got to avoid that at all costs. In Japanese culture, the worst thing that could happen was disgrace. They were told they were the best. And they'd been told they were the best for 1,000 years. And by the way, this is your trivia question for the day that you can use on Jeopardy. The little island of Japan takes on the Russian Empire in 1905. And who wins? Japan. So you get this long history where you have victory after victory after victory. And you become convinced that you can't be defeated. You remember the movie Patton? How does George C. Scott start that movie? America's never lost a war. So if you ingrain that into a culture, people who shouldn't be great fighters, if they believe enough what you are telling them, they're going to be formidable. they're going to be formidable. And the Japanese during the Second World War, in many situations, fought until there were just a few hundred troops left before they finally surrendered. You'd have an island with 50,000 Japanese, and you would take 200 prisoners because they believed that death was not that bad a deal. Disgrace. They want to avoid that. So the Egyptians believe that Pharaoh is God. Pharaoh believes that he is God. And it's such an incredible contrast from the Pharaoh that Joseph dealt with, who seems to be a person of incredible ability to see the big picture and to realize I'm not the smartest guy in the room, and to know instantly Joseph's the smartest guy in the room. And guess what? He's got a direct connection with the God that can tell you what's going to happen 14 years into the future. I want this guy on my team. And of course, it's interesting in the book of Exodus, the text begins, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. I don't know whether that means he'd never heard of Joseph. The context is he could have cared less about what Joseph had done for the Egyptians. And so God says in Exodus chapter 7, I will harden Pharaoh's heart that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. He's going to do things that demonstrate not just to Egypt, but to the entire world that God is supreme. And of course, he's dealing with a country that is really the world's only superpower at the time. And so it starts off with the miracle of the staff. And what was the miracle of the staff? They take the staff and throw it down, and it does what? Turns into a snake. Turns into a snake. And what do Pharaoh's wise men and magicians do? They do the same thing, but what happens to their snakes? Gobbled up, right? Now, you know, there's a lot of conversation about, is this a trick? I mean, are they doing something like Harry Houdini would do? Or is there some sort of divine, you know, power in what they're able to perform? Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I've had a chance to see some of the finest magicians in the world and to see them up close. And they can do things that I can't explain, but they would all tell me the same thing, which is it's not divine power, it's just a trick. Sometimes as human beings, we see things that we can't explain, and even when somebody is telling us it's a trick, we have a hard time believing them if it's fantastic enough. The great Harry Houdini was very close friends with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle wrote the Sherlock Holmes books. He was a medical doctor, somebody that you think would think logically, but he'd lost a son during the First World War. And so he got caught up in spiritualism. And he wants Houdini to go with him to a seance. And Houdini's like, I'll go. I'm not really buying this, but I'll keep an open mind. And so they ask Houdini, who do you want to call up? And they call up his mother, his dead mother. And Houdini has this long conversation with his mother. And Doyle is like, see, it works. And Houdini goes, Arthur, I don't know what you're talking about. My dead mother never spoke a word of English in her entire life. Because this was as fake as anything could possibly be. Doyle was never convinced because the magicians seemed so great. So I don't know whether they're tying into some sort of supernatural power. Text doesn't really say. What do we know generally, though, about people that are magicians that we find in the Old Testament? How efficacious are their abilities? How did the children of Israel get to Egypt? Pharaoh dreams a dream, and what does he do? He calls for his magicians. How many of them could tell him anything about the dream? Nobody. Nebuchadnezzar, same thing, right? He's got that great dream of the image with the head of gold, right? And Nebuchadnezzar didn't just fall off the turnip train either, did he? Because what does he do to make sure that he's going to get a real answer? Tell me the dream and the interpretation. And what do his magicians say to that? Impossible. Nobody can do that. That trick's too great. It's like raising the dead. That's not happening when somebody's been dead 4 days. You're not going to be able to raise them. Whatever the case is here, what we know is the power of God is greater than the power of the magicians, because the snake of Moses consumes the snake of the wise men. The Lord then said to Moses in Exodus 7:14, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. He refuses to let the people go. And so we begin with the plagues. And the first plague was the water turned to blood. And once again, what do the magicians do? Same thing. Or at least they appear to do the same thing. And now you've got two audiences involved in this. And who are the two great audiences that are watching this contest? You've got the Israelites, right? The children of Israel, the Jews, and you got the Egyptians. And the contest is going to soon get more interesting because God's going to differentiate between what's happening in Goshen, where the children of Israel are, and what's going on with the Egyptians. But none of this is being done, in a vacuum, right? People then are just as consumed as what's going on with the royal family as people are today. They just didn't have the tabloids and the internet. Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. So the waters turned to blood, Exodus chapter 7, verse 15 to 25. The Egyptians did the same with their secret acts. Next comes the plague of the frogs. Once again, the magicians do the same with their secret acts, making frogs come into the land of Egypt. And when all this is happening, the situation is becoming what? What's sort of happening when you look at the plagues being performed? We used to talk about the misery index. I haven't heard that term in a long time. What's happening to the misery index with each plague? It's going up. They're turning the heat on. And the people are watching all of this. The children of Israel are watching it. The Egyptians are watching all this. The waters turn to blood. We then have the frogs. Pharaoh now wants relief, and he asks for relief, and Moses brings relief, but it says that he hardened his heart, verse 15 of Exodus chapter 8, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. And next comes plagues 3 and 4, the lice and the gnats. And here it's interesting because in Exodus chapter 18, verse 19, it says, the magicians tried with their secret acts to bring forth gnats or flies, but they could not. And so there were gnats on man and beast. And then what did the magicians say to Pharaoh? It's the finger of God. Somebody who's a real magician knows what the real deal is. Harry Houdini knew what the real deal was. And if somebody could have really called up his dead mother from the grave, Houdini would have been the first person to testify to the power of the spiritualist. He knows what the finger of God is, and he knows when people are faking it. And Houdini spends much of the rest of his life trying to debunk spiritualism. The idea that you can talk to somebody from the dead is as patently false as anything you could find. And Houdini, he had a standing offer, which is, I can do anything the spiritualists can do. I can do it twice as good as how they can do it, and I can tell you how I did it. Right? Very, very effective. We only really know, at least I can only think of one. Maybe there's more than one. I can only think of one time when somebody's really called up from the dead. Does anybody remember when that happens in the Bible? Samuel, right? Saul wants Samuel called up. And what does Samuel have to say? Well, he starts with, what do you bother me for? And then what does he say? What does he say? You're going to die. Rule 1 is if you can really call somebody up from the dead, don't do it. You're not going to hear anything you want to hear. If you could do it, you're not going to hear anything you want to hear, right? Would spiritualists make any money if that was their shtick, bringing somebody up from the dead to berate you? And that worthless son, I can't believe. No. It's the finger of God. These magicians, whatever their talents, whatever their abilities are, they know the difference between the real deal and themselves. And they tell Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. Does Pharaoh listen? No. We're back to human pride. If I think that I'm the smartest guy in the room, I'm not listening to you. No matter what's about to happen to me, no matter how catastrophic things may be, I'm not listening to you if I think God is on my side. And so the magicians say, look, this is the finger of God. We can't do this. But the text says Pharaoh's heart was hardened, And he didn't listen to them. So he hasn't listened to Moses. He hasn't listened to Aaron. He hasn't listened to the first few plagues. Now his own magicians are saying it's the finger of God. We cannot do this. You're not dealing with something normal here. And nevertheless, he hardens his heart. In Exodus 8:25, we have this interesting compromise that Pharaoh offers up. So they want to go into the wilderness to sacrifice, and this compromise that's offered in Exodus 8:25, he says, go sacrifice to your God within the land. If you want to sacrifice to God, that's okay, but this idea, going 3 days journey into the wilderness, I don't like that. What do you think is going on here? What does God call the children of Israel to do? Go 3 days journey. And offer sacrifices. Why do you think Pharaoh is like, no, just you could do that here? Going to negotiate? Is he worried about him coming back? Don't know. He wants to be in control, doesn't he? The devil kind of does that with us. The devil's like, it's all right if you want to be a Christian. Just, you don't really have to leave your old way of life. I've got a auto recording of Carl Ketcherside talking about his father's conversion. And his father lived a life very much like my grandfather. Working in the lead belt, mining as a lead zinc miner. And Ketcherside said that his father could hardly utter a word without saying something profane. And that all of a sudden somebody in the mine starts teaching and preaching, to the dad. Well, you can't really get away when you're underground, right? You're working with that miner, you can curse him out, and you can do everything you want, but there's nowhere to really run. And day after day, there's a brother in the mines with Ketcherside's father who's preaching the gospel to him. And part of what he emphasizes is, here's what repentance is. It's a true change of life. It doesn't mean that you stay where you are and be a Christian. You're going to get as far away from that kind of life as you can. And Ketcherside was about 10 years old when his father was converted, and it created a sensation in their town because everybody knew there wasn't anybody meaner and uglier and more profane than Carl Ketcherside's dad. And Ketcherside can't believe that his father's about to become a Christian. And the day he becomes a Christian, he immediately gives up certain things that he'd always done. He'd always smoked above ground and chewed underground. He was convinced that he needed to give those things up. He gave them up that day, threw them out. He played the fiddle at dances. He was convinced that was wrong. He got rid of the fiddle. He was convinced that profanity was wrong, and Carl says it took his father a little while to work through that, right? Because that can become very ingrained in people's minds. But the point he was making was, as much as he understood it, and whether these are things that you would understand that you would have to all give up or not to become a Christian, Carl's father understood that he did. And if I understand in my heart that I should give things up when I become a Christian, I'm not going to tarry in the land of evil. I'm not going to try to be a Christian in name only. I'm going to come out from among those things. I'm going to repent. And true repentance is this idea of turning. I'm going this direction. Now I'm going to go 180 degrees in the opposite direction because I want to follow God. So the devil is always trying to offer us this compromise, right? The devil is always saying to us, go sacrifice to God within the land. You don't really have to change much. Kind of keep living as you're living. If you want to kill a couple hours on a Sunday, that's okay. But you don't really have to change. You don't really have to be completely obedient to God. There's a real power in a changed life. And too often we're not as effective in our Christian lives as we should be because we've got stuff that's in the land of Egypt that we never got rid of. We knew we should have gotten rid of it. We just didn't do it. And then it's got a hold of us. And what happens to us a lot of times is when I don't resolve to get rid of things immediately, they become very hard to get rid of later because they get a hold of us. So Pharaoh offers a compromise, and God isn't interested in compromise, and so the answer is no. And then a second compromise is offered. I will let you go that you can sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, only don't go very far. If I can't keep total control of you, I'm going to try to keep you as close as I can. You're surely not going to need to go 3 days' journey into the wilderness. That is absurd. And this is the same kind of thing, again, that the devil tries to use on us. Go, but just don't, if you really got to go, don't go very far. Don't go very far. That's a hard thing, right, for us to totally change and begin to walk down that path where we're transformed into the image of Christ, because there's just so much stuff we have trouble giving up. So we either want to stay in the land, or if we get out of the land, we don't want to go very far. Pharaoh's offering compromises. God's not interested in compromise. When God wants us, when he wants us and our life to be changed, he wants all of us. He wants us totally dedicated to him. The Bible says that God is a jealous God. You ever thought about what that means? God is a jealous God. Craig is saying sometimes in our culture we think that jealousy is not a good thing. What do you think that means? You ever been married to or dated a jealous person? Is that bad? I can assure you, Miss Gardner would not condone me hanging around with somebody I shouldn't be hanging around with for 5 seconds, because she's a jealous woman, right? And I'm using jealous in the positive sense. This is the sense in which what God is saying is you cannot serve God and mammon, right? It's the point that Jesus is making in the book of Matthew. You can't be devoted to God and money. They're two things of totally opposite persuasions. It's impossible. In that sense, God is a jealous God. He demands 100% of us. I can't serve God and somebody else. And that, by the way, is what culture has been like throughout most of the world history. It's not been about people saying you can't serve God. It's like, just don't be so narrow-minded. You can serve God plus all these other gods. You can serve God plus money. We'll just have it all. When the Apostle Paul is at the Areopagus, right, there in Athens, what does he see?
Idol to the unknown God.
He sees they've got idols to everything. Before he even gets to the unknown God, what have they got idols to? Every god under the sun, because they don't want to offend anybody. And then, just in case they left somebody out, they've got an altar to the unknown God. Isn't that America in the 21st century?
Can't accuse him of not being thorough.
They were into diversity, weren't they? They were into as much diversity as possible. That is the kind of culture that they lived in. So they didn't have a problem with people serving God. And of course, Paul points out that the God you worship in ignorance, let me tell you about the unknown God. And of course, they didn't really want to hear what Paul had to say about the unknown God. And that's sometimes how the world is, because what do we know about God? God is a jealous God. There isn't room for God in any other God. There isn't room for God in any passion like money that's going to get in the way of my service to God. And Ketcherside's father understood that, maybe in an imperfect way, but he understood the principle in 100% the right way, which is anything that he saw that was going to get in the way of his service to God, he was going to get rid of, and he was going to get rid of it now, to the best of his ability, right? Doesn't always mean I can get rid of everything when I make that commitment. And this is my point about profanity. It took him several months to overcome that. But what he could get rid of immediately, he did. What he couldn't get rid of immediately, he made a conscious effort to do everything in his power to get rid of it as soon as he possibly could. And that's what God calls us to. God's a jealous God. It's jealous in a good sense. It's jealous in the sense that there's not room for me to serve God and me to serve anyone else. There is no religious diversity. There are not many paths to get to God. Jesus said, I am the way. Pharaoh is trying to compromise, trying to work things out, and the devil is working with Pharaoh to do that. The devil works on us just 100% in the same way that he's working through Pharaoh. Well, then we have the plague of the livestock: donkeys, camels, herds, flocks. Exodus chapter 9, 1 through 7, followed by the plague of the boils. And I find this one kind of fascinating. I mean, the boils were incredibly painful. I mean, the human body is kind of an interesting thing because how small of a thing can give us a lot of trouble physically. Most moles are benign, but you get a mole in the wrong place. I had a mole once right on my rear end, and every time I sat down, I'm sitting on that mole, and then that mole began to bleed, and that mole began to cause me trouble. But it was a teeny tiny little thing. More of my medical history than you ever wanted to know. That's how we all are, though, right? You get a hangnail. You get any kind of a physical problem that is chronic and irritates, even if it's just a little bit at a time, gradually just drives you crazy. To the point that you're willing to go and have the doctor remove it surgically or do whatever needs to be done. We're funny about doctors a lot of times, right? Because we try to put it off, and then what happens? Situation becomes bad enough, and all of a sudden, my reticence about seeing the doctor goes right out the window. I want to see him now. I want him to fix me yesterday. I want you to give me the golden pill, the golden bullet. I will take the golden shot, even if it's got to be in my rear end where the mole used to be. I'll take whatever it takes. Yeah. Plague of the boils. The boils made them miserable. Boils all over their body. And I love this from Exodus chapter 9, verse 11. The magicians, who Pharaoh's always kind of calling on to give him moral support, says the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians as well as on all the other Egyptians. Well, that's kind of game, set, and match as far as the magicians go, isn't it? They can't even, they're not only not trying to imitate it, they're like, make it go away. Make it go away. The boils. Exodus 9, verses 18 to 35, we've got the plague of the hail. All of these things are happening one after another, and they're gradually making people more and more and more miserable. And the misery scale is going up and up and up, and the misery scale is going to continue to go up until you get to the death of the firstborn. And over and over and over again, Pharaoh hardens his heart, and now God begins to harden Pharaoh's heart because I believe God has determined we're going to destroy the power of the Egyptians. We're going to spoil this situation in front of the entire world and do it in such a way that people will know that there is a God on earth, and it's Jehovah. It's not any of the gods of the Egyptians. And a lot of these plagues, by the way, are things that go right at things that the Egyptians would worship. And they're showing God's superiority over the gods of the Egyptians. And they're showing that ultimately there's no comparison between Jehovah God, the living God, and the things that we tend to worship. We tend to worship things that can't do us any good, that can't hear us, that can't see us. And you see that in this kind of parallel passage where God deals with Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuchadnezzar's pride and the pride of his grandson or great-grandson Belshazzar when he is worshiping and praising gods of stone and steel and metal that can't see and can't hear, and completely ignoring what Daniel says was the God whose breath is in his hand. That, to me, it's such an interesting image. I mean, what does that convey to you, the idea that somebody's got your breath in their hand? Say again? They have my life, but what does it say about my life? It's not in my control. And we don't normally go around thinking about the fragility of life until what happens? Well, until all of a sudden I think I'm facing my own mortality. Then we start thinking about it. But the truth is, every one of our lives is an incredibly fragile thing. James says that our life's like a vapor that appears for but a brief time and then vanishes away. We're here for this incredibly short amount of time. And over again throughout the Bible, there are all these images that talk about the brevity of life. We're like the grass which is here today and burn in the fire tomorrow. Right? All of those things are trying to convey to our mind how brief that our time here is and how fragile life is. And we know that's true. We've all known people that died under the most strange circumstances, or under circumstances where you'd think that thing could have happened 100 times and you wouldn't even been hurt. But that person, as a result, passed away. So this idea that my breath is in God's hands is an emphasis about the fragility of life, but also I want to be on the right team. I want to be on the team with the guy that's got my breath in his hands, because he's got the power and the ability to take care of me either in this life or in the world to come. Paul in Romans, the 14th chapter, says, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. That's the mindset I want to have, because I can't control how I'm going to die. Maybe I'm the only one, but I've often thought, I don't want to die doing something really stupid. I know I've got to die, but there's a few ways I would prefer to go, as opposed to a whole list of ways I'd prefer not to go. And I'd really like to go not doing something stupid. One of the things I do is read old magazines and papers, and every so often I'll just read the most bizarre story. And this one guy was sealing his garage with highly flammable something or another. He works his way into the corner. He's got it all done. He's just going to stand in the corner and let everything dry. Lights up a cigarette. I could see somebody in my family going that way. So you're thinking, what? You just have to not think for a second. That's how incredibly fragile life is. So as we move through these first 5 or 6 plagues, what we're seeing is the plagues are getting stronger and stronger. Number 2, we see that there's no room for God in anybody else. It's not going to be God and the gods of the Egyptians. There's no God diversity that he's into. There aren't going to be many paths to success. There's only one thing for Pharaoh to do, that is obey God and humble himself. And he's made up his mind he's not going to do that. And so God determines that at a certain point the game is over. Pharaoh is going to be spoiled, destroyed, in a way that the whole world is going to see. Number 3, we understand the fact that this business of going to sacrifice to God either within the land or not going very far is not a total wholehearted commitment to God. What God asked me to do, I've got to do. There's no room for compromise. It's not, let's make a deal. It's not, Lord, I'll meet you this far. It's not, Lord, if you'll do X, I'll do Y. There is no compromise. God is a jealous God. God expects me to be completely 100% obedient and wholly devoted to him. And we see all these lessons as we begin to move through the plagues. And there'll be a lot more that we can learn and look at. All right, we will stop there. I'm going to be out of town next Sunday. Lyle will be pinch hitting either with the next group of plagues or with something else. He may decide to do a one-off. We'll leave it up to him. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.